Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at malware analysis, and you've given us a ton of stuff to look at: textbooks, real-world malware, all kinds of things.
Yeah. We'll be dissecting these malicious programs, sort of like a digital autopsy to see what they're made of, how they tick, and ultimately how to take them down.
Digital autopsy, I like that. So where do we even begin with malware analysis? It seems like such a complicated field.
Well, you'd be surprised. It's actually more approachable than you'd think. We start with the basics, just like any good investigation, right? There are different ways to analyze malware, each with its own strengths and weaknesses.
Oh, okay, cool. Let's start breaking down these different approaches. What's the first one we should know about?
The first one is static analysis. Imagine you're a detective and you're examining a suspect's blueprint for a crime. With static analysis, we look at the code without actually running it. So we can look for key things like the file type, maybe some hidden text strings, what libraries it uses, hints about what it's going to do.
So it's like getting a sneak peek into the malware's potential, but safely, without actually letting it loose.
Exactly. We don't want to risk getting infected.
Right. Are there tools specifically for this kind of static analysis?
Yeah, for sure. We use tools like hex editors to look at the raw data, then hashing algorithms to create like a digital fingerprint so we can compare it with known malware, and even custom rules sometimes to catch those sneaky malware families.
Sounds pretty technical. But what about actually seeing what this malware does when it infects a system?
Well, that's where dynamic analysis comes in. Think of it like observing a suspect in action, like watching their every move. We run the malware, but we got to be super careful, so we use a controlled environment like a virtual machine.
A virtual machine, is that like a sandbox?
Yeah, exactly. Isolated and safe, that's the key.
So you're basically setting a trap for the malware, letting it think it's running free, but secretly watching its every move.
You got it. We watch everything, the processes it starts, any changes it makes to files, the registry, and especially important, we watch how it tries to communicate over the network.
Wait, so you can actually see what websites or servers the malware tries to talk to?
Absolutely. That's how we often find those command and control servers, the secret headquarters the attackers use to control their little malware army.
So static analysis gives us the blueprint, and dynamic analysis shows us the malware in action. What if we need to go deeper, though, to really see how it's built, how it works?
Well, for that, we use code analysis. It's the most detailed level of analysis. You need a good understanding of how programming works, even assembly language. Think of it like taking apart a clock to see how all the gears and springs fit together.
Now you're talking my language. So how do you actually do that? Where do you even start?
Well, the first step is disassembly. We take the malware's code and we convert it into something a little more human readable. It's called assembly language. And then we start reverse engineering it step by step. It's like trying to reconstruct the thought process of the malware author.
Wow, that sounds like a challenge.
It definitely is, but it can also be really rewarding. The things you can learn from code analysis are super valuable.
So we've got the basics: static, dynamic, and code analysis. But those malware authors, they're tricky, right? They're always trying to make things harder for you. How do they do that?
Oh yeah, they have their ways. One of their favorites is obfuscation. It's like, imagine you're trying to read a book where all the words are just scrambled up. That's what they do to the code. They try to make it really hard to understand.
So it's a code within a code. What are some ways they do this scrambling tricks?
They have a few favorites. One is encoding. They might convert the code into a different format, like base 64, or they might shift the characters around, like using the old Caesar cipher trick. And they can also encrypt the code with things like DES or AES. And then there's packing. That's where they essentially compress the whole thing, make it smaller and harder to see what's inside.
It's like they're creating a digital puzzle box, trying to hide their evil little secrets.
Exactly. Luckily, we've got tools and techniques to fight back, to identify and unpack this stuff. It's a constant arms race, though.
Sounds like it. So we've covered the basics: static, dynamic, and code analysis. And we've even touched on some of those advanced techniques, those obfuscation tricks that malware authors use to hide their code. It's like a whole secret world out there.
It is. And that's just the beginning. We've only just scratched the surface. There's a whole lot more to learn about how malware works and how we can analyze it to protect ourselves.
Okay, so we've set the stage, we've got the basics down. Now let's dive a little deeper into those techniques. What else is out there that can help us uncover those hidden layers of malware?
Well, one of the most important is the debugger. It allows us to actually step through the malware, instruction by instructions, like slowing down time, watching the malware in slow motion.
Oh, wow. So you can actually see every single step it takes.
Yeah. We can examine what's happening, see what values are stored in memory, how the code branches and jumps around.
So you can pinpoint exactly where they're using those obfuscation tricks.
Exactly. And we can use breakpoints to pause the code at certain spots and see what's going on. It's really powerful stuff.
But debuggers are just one tool, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. There's scripting, too, which is super handy for automating all those repetitive tasks. And then there's code emulation. That one's a lifesaver when you're dealing with malware that could be really dangerous.
I can imagine. Wouldn't want to run that stuff on my own machine.
Exactly. With emulation, we can run the malware in a totally safe, isolated environment without any risk of infection.
Sounds like a good idea. What kind of tools do you use for that?
Well, there are a few popular ones out there. QEMU and Box are both really versatile. They can emulate tons of different processors and operating systems.
So it's like building a whole virtual computer just to run this nasty code.
Pretty much. It's really helpful, though.
I bet. Okay, so we've got debuggers, scripting, and emulators. What else is in the malware analyst's toolkit? Anything else essential for this intermediate level stuff?
Well, one that's becoming more and more important these days is memory forensics.
Memory forensics. Now that sounds interesting. Tell me more.
Well, as malware gets more advanced, it often tries to hide itself entirely in memory. That means it doesn't leave any traces on the hard drive, making it much harder to detect with traditional methods.
So it's like a ghost in the machine, leaving no physical evidence behind. How do you even find something like that?
It's tough. We need to capture a snapshot of the computer's memory, basically freeze it in time, and then examine it using special tools. We're looking for clues, remnants of what the malware was doing.
Wow. What kind of tools do you use for that?
Well, there's one called volatility that's really powerful. It can show us all sorts of stuff. Running processes, files that were open, network connections, even bits and pieces of deleted files.
Sounds like you're doing some serious digital detective work.
You could say that. And the more sophisticated malware, the more important these techniques become.
Okay, so we've got our debuggers, scripts, emulators, and now memory forensics tools. It's not quite the arsenal you've got there. But I gotta ask, what else should we know about these techniques? Anything crucial before we go even deeper?
Well, I think the key thing to remember is that this field is constantly evolving. Attackers are always coming up with new tricks, new ways to hide their malware.
So it's not enough to just learn the tools.
Mhm.
You need to stay ahead of the game, constantly learning and adapting.
Exactly. It's a never-ending challenge, but that's part of what makes it so exciting. We're constantly learning, pushing the boundaries of what we know. It's a real battle of wits.
A battle of wits, I like that.
And the stakes are high because we're talking about protecting people's data, their privacy, even their safety.
Okay, that's a good point. It's not just a game, it's serious business.
Mhm.
But before we get too deep into that, maybe we can take a step back and talk a bit about the human element of all this. You mentioned earlier that psychology plays a role in malware analysis. Can you expand on that a bit?
Oh, absolutely. You got to remember that at the end of the day, malware is created by people. And those people have their own motivations, their own goals, even their own biases that can shape the malware they create.
So it's not just about the code, it's about understanding the minds behind the code.
Exactly. By trying to get inside the attacker's head, we can often predict what they might do next, what techniques they might use, even what vulnerabilities they might target.
So it's like profiling a criminal, but in the digital world.
You got it. And the more we understand about the attacker, the better we can defend against them.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not just a technical challenge, it's also a psychological one. But before we go even further, is there anything else we need to know about these techniques?
Well, I think it's important to remember that this is a field that's always changing, always evolving. What we're talking about today, these techniques and tools, they might be different tomorrow. So the most important thing is to have a solid foundation, a deep understanding of how things work, so you can adapt as the threat landscape changes.
So it's about constantly learning, constantly experimenting, and always staying one step ahead of those attackers.
That's it in a nutshell.
All right, challenge accepted. I'm ready to dive even deeper into these techniques and see how they can help us crack those malware mysteries wide open.
Let's do it. And remember, with every piece of malware we analyze, with every puzzle we solve, we're making the world a little bit safer for everyone.
Okay, I like the sound of that. So let's get back to those intermediate level techniques. You mentioned debuggers, scripting, and emulation. Can you give us a concrete example of how these techniques work together in analyzing a specific piece of malware?
Sure. Let's say we're looking at a piece of malware that's packed. That means that the actual malicious code is hidden and compressed inside the executable file. And our first goal is to find what's called the original entry point, or OEP. That's the point in the code where the unpacked malware actually starts running.
Sounds simple enough,
Hmm?
but I bet it's not always that easy.
You're right. Those packers, they use all sorts of tricks to hide the OEP. They might use jump instructions or code obfuscation, you name it. But that's where our trusty debugger comes in. We can use it to step through the code slowly and carefully, watching for signs of the unpacking process.
So you're like a detective, carefully following a trail of breadcrumbs, hoping to find the hidden treasure.
That's a great way to put it. And once we find the OEP, we can use a technique called dumping to extract the unpacked code from memory.
Dumping. So you're basically taking a snapshot of the code in its purest form before it can hide itself again.
Exactly. And then once we have that unpacked code, we can use static analysis techniques like disassembling and reverse engineering to really understand what it's doing.
So it's a combination of dynamic analysis with the debugger and then static analysis to get the full picture. What about those other techniques you mentioned, like scripting and emulation? How do they fit into this whole process?
Well, scripting can be super useful for automating all those repetitive tasks, like searching for specific patterns in the code or analyzing large amounts of data. We can write custom scripts to do a lot of the heavy lifting for us.
Ah, so it's like having a little digital assistant to help you with the boring stuff.
Exactly. It frees up our time to focus on the more complex parts of the analysis. And then there's emulation, which, as we mentioned before, is crucial when we're dealing with potentially dangerous malware. We can run it in a safe environment without risking infection.
Safety first, right.
Always.
Okay, so we've got our debuggers, our scripting tools, and our emulators. What else do we need in our intermediate malware analysis toolbox?
Well, one technique that's becoming more and more important is memory forensics.
Memory forensics, you mentioned that before. Tell me more. Why is that so important?
Well, as malware gets more sophisticated, it's designed to run only in memory, leaving no trace on the hard drive. This makes it much harder to detect using traditional methods.
Ah, so it's like those stealthy ninjas leaving no footprints behind.
Exactly. And to analyze this kind of malware, we need to capture a snapshot of the computer's memory, what we call a memory dump.
A memory dump, so you're basically freezing time, capturing everything that's happening in the computer's memory at a specific moment.
That's a great way to put it. And then we use special tools to analyze that snapshot, those memory dumps.
What kind of tools are we talking about?
Well, there's one called volatility, which is really powerful. It lets us look at the processes that we're running, the files that were open, network connections, all sorts of things.
So even though the malware isn't physically present on the hard drive, you can still find traces of its activity in memory. It's like finding fingerprints at a crime scene, right?
Exactly. And with enough skill and patience, we can piece those traces together to understand how the malware works, what it did, and who might be behind it.
This is incredible. It's like you're a digital archaeologist excavating the remnants of a cyber attack.
That's a great analogy. And just like archaeologists, we need to be careful and meticulous, paying attention to every detail. Every little clue can be important.
Okay, so we've got our debuggers for stepping through code, our scripting for automation, our emulators for safe execution, and now memory forensics tools for those sneaky memory-resident threats. We're really building up our arsenal.
And that arsenal is constantly evolving.
Mm.
As attackers get more sophisticated, we need to stay ahead of the curve, developing new tools and techniques to fight back.
I'm definitely feeling inspired to learn more about this.
And those humans, they have motivations, goals, even biases that can influence the way they design their malware.
So it's not just about dissecting the code. It's about understanding the psychology behind it, the motivations and intentions of the attackers.
Exactly. And by studying the attackers, their methods, their patterns, we can often anticipate what they might do next, what techniques they might use, even what vulnerabilities they might target. It's like profiling a criminal, but in the digital world.
Wow, that's fascinating. We've talked about the challenges, the tools, and even the psychological dimension of this fascinating field. What advice would you give to someone who's just starting out in malware analysis? What are the key skills and resources they should focus on developing?
That's a great question. For those just starting their journey into malware analysis, I'd recommend focusing on building a strong foundation in a few key areas.
Okay, a strong foundation. What are the building blocks?
Well, first and foremost, you need a solid understanding of operating systems. You need to know how they work, how they manage processes and memory, how files are stored and accessed. This knowledge is absolutely essential for understanding how malware interacts with the system and what clues to look for during analysis.
Operating systems, got it. What else is crucial?
Next, you need to learn at least the basics of assembly language. It's the language that bridges the gap between the code we write as humans and the machine instructions that the computer actually executes.
Assembly language, yeah, I've heard it could be pretty daunting.
It can be, but don't let that intimidate you. There are lots of great resources available online, tutorials and courses that can make it easier to grasp. And once you understand assembly language, you'll have a much deeper understanding of how malware works at its core.
Assembly language, check.
Hmm.
What other skills should aspiring malware analysts be working on?
Scripting is another valuable skill. Python especially is really useful for automating tasks, analyzing data, even building your own custom tools.
Python scripting, noted. Anything else?
Networking fundamentals are crucial too. Malware often communicates with external servers, so you need to understand how networks work, the protocols they use, how to analyze network traffic. This will help you track down those command and control servers and figure out what the malware is up to.
Networking, got it. So we've got operating systems, assembly language, scripting, and networking. That's quite the list. Any other tips for those just starting out?
Yeah, don't be afraid to get your hands dirty. Set up a safe analysis environment, maybe download some malware samples from reputable sources, of course, and start playing around with the tools and techniques we've talked about today.
So it's all about learning by doing, experimenting, and getting some hands-on experience.
Exactly. And remember, there's a whole community of malware analysts out there. There are forums, blogs, social media groups where you can connect with other people, ask questions, share what you've learned. Don't be afraid to reach out and get involved.
The power of community. Love it. Okay, so we've got our foundation of knowledge, our tools and techniques, and our supportive community. What else is essential for success in this field?
You know, perhaps the most important thing of all is curiosity. You need to be driven by a desire to learn, to understand how things work, to solve puzzles, and you need to be adaptable because the threat landscape is always changing. The best malware analysts are the ones who never stop learning, who are always looking for new challenges and pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
Relentless curiosity, I like that. It's the fuel that drives innovation and discovery.
Exactly, and that's what makes this field so fascinating and rewarding. It's a constant challenge, a never-ending quest for knowledge, and a chance to really make a difference in the fight against cybercrime.
This has been incredibly inspiring. Well, I think it's time to move on to part 2 of our deep dive and explore those intermediate techniques in more detail. Are you ready?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
You said that malware often comes packaged in a way that hides its true intentions. It's like receiving a suspicious package wrapped in layers and layers of tape and bubble wrap. You know there's something in there, but you have no idea what it is until you unwrap it.
That's a perfect analogy. And just like with a suspicious package, unpacking malware needs to be done carefully in a controlled environment so we don't accidentally unleash something dangerous.
That makes sense. So how do you even begin to unpack malware? What are the first steps?
Well, the first step is to identify what type of packer was used. There are tons of different packers out there, each with its own unique characteristics and methods of obfuscation.
So it's like trying to figure out what kind of lock is on the box before you can even start looking for the key.
Exactly. And luckily, we have tools that can help us with this identification process. There's one called PEID that can analyze the executable file and give us some hints about which packer might have been used. Once we have a good idea of what type of packer we're dealing with, we can start looking for clues about how to unpack it.
Clues. What kind of clues are we talking about?
Well, we're looking for patterns in the code, specific instructions that suggest the unpacking process is about to happen. For example, some packers will allocate a large chunk of memory, which is a pretty good sign that they're about to unpack the code into that space.
So you're looking for those subtle hints, those digital breadcrumbs that the packer has left behind.
Precisely. And our debugger is a really valuable tool for this kind of analysis. We can set breakpoints at specific points in the code and then step through the execution one instruction at a time, watching for those telltale signs.
It's like setting up a surveillance camera inside the malware, watching it in slow motion as it tries to unpack itself.
Exactly. And once we've identified the unpacking routine, we can use that dumping technique we talked about before to extract the unpacked code from memory.
So you're catching the malware red-handed, grabbing the unpacked code before it has a chance to disappear back into the shadows.
You got it. And once we have that unpacked code, we can really start analyzing it using static analysis techniques like disassembling and reverse engineering to understand what it's really doing.
Okay, this unpacking process is fascinating. But I imagine it can get pretty complicated, especially with those highly sophisticated packers that use all sorts of tricks and obfuscation techniques.
Oh, absolutely. Unpacking malware can be incredibly challenging, and it definitely requires a deep understanding of packers, debuggers, and how operating systems work at a low level. But it's a crucial skill for any malware analyst. And the stakes are high because if we can't unpack the malware, we can't analyze it, and we can't develop effective countermeasures.
Okay, I'm starting to see how unpacking malware is like a critical first step in the whole analysis process. But what about those situations where you just can't unpack the malware? What happens then?
Well, in those cases, we have to get creative. We might try using different unpacking tools or experimenting with different debugging techniques. Sometimes we even have to try to manually reverse engineer the packer itself, which can be incredibly challenging.
Manually reverse engineer the packer. Wow, that sounds tough.
It is. It takes a lot of skill and patience, but sometimes it's the only way to get to the bottom of things.
Okay, so unpacking malware is not for the faint of heart. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about another technique, decrypting malware. You mentioned earlier that malware authors often use encryption to scramble their code and hide their malicious intentions. How do you go about breaking those encryption codes?
Decrypting malware is actually quite similar to unpacking in a lot of ways. Our first goal is to identify the encryption algorithm that's being used.
So once again, it's like figuring out what kind of lock is on the box before you can even start looking for the key.
Exactly. And just like with packers, we have tools that can help us identify the encryption algorithm. PEID, that Swiss Army knife we talked about before, can actually do that too. Once we know what kind of encryption we're dealing with, we can start looking for the decryption key.
The decryption key, that's the magic code that unlocks the scrambled code and reveals the malware's true intentions.
Right.
Right?
And finding that key can be like searching for a needle in a haystack. We often have to analyze the malware's behavior, how it interacts with the system, its network communication, to try to find clues that might lead us to the key. It can be both incredibly frustrating and incredibly rewarding.
Okay, so you've identified the encryption algorithm, you found the decryption key. What happens next? How do you actually decrypt the code?
Well, once we have the key, we can either use a decryption tool or write a custom script to decrypt the code.
So it's like having the combination to a safe. You can just open it up and see what's inside.
Exactly. And once we have the decrypted code, we can analyze it just like any other piece of malware using those static analysis techniques we talked about before.
This whole process is fascinating. But I imagine there are times when finding that decryption key is just impossible. What do you do in those situations?
Well, in those cases, we have to get a little more creative. We might try using brute force techniques to try every possible key combination, or we might try to find weaknesses in the encryption algorithm itself, some way to exploit it and decrypt the code without the key.
Brute force. Wow, that sounds like it could take forever.
It can, and that's why it's usually a last resort, but sometimes it's the only option we have.
You explained that some malware is designed to reside only in memory, leaving no traces on the hard drive. How do you even begin to analyze something that's essentially invisible?
That's a great question. Analyzing memory-resident malware can be incredibly challenging, but it's becoming more and more important these days as more and more malware authors are using this technique.
I can see why. It's like trying to catch a ghost. How do you even know it's there if it doesn't leave any physical evidence?
Well, the first step is to suspect that memory-resident malware might be present. This could be based on unusual system behavior, suspicious network activity, or other indicators of compromise. Once we suspect that memory-resident malware might be involved, we need to capture a snapshot of the computer's memory, what we call a memory dump.
A memory dump, so you're essentially freezing the computer's memory in time, capturing everything that's happening at the exact moment.
Precisely. And then we use special tools to analyze the contents of that memory dump.
Okay, so you've got your memory dump. What happens next? What kind of tools do you use to analyze it?
Well, there are some really powerful tools out there, like one called Volatility, that are specifically designed for analyzing memory dumps. Volatility can do a lot. It lets us examine the processes that were running, the files that were open, the network connections that were active, even the contents of memory that was recently accessed.
So even though the malware isn't physically present on the hard drive, you can still find traces of its activity in the computer's memory.
That's right. It's like finding fingerprints at a crime scene, even if the criminal has already left.
Okay, so we've talked about unpacking, decrypting, and now memory forensics. It sounds like these techniques are absolutely essential for any malware analyst who really wants to understand how these malicious programs work. But I'm curious, how does all of this fit into the bigger picture of fighting cybercrime?
Well, the insights we gain from malware analysis are used in a lot of different ways. They inform incident response, threat intelligence, vulnerability research, even the development of new security products. Well, the main reason's pretty simple. They want their malware to stay hidden for as long as possible. Obfuscation techniques, things like packing and encryption, they can help malware evade those traditional antivirus programs that rely on signature-based detection.
So it's like they're giving the malware a disguise, helping it slip past the security guards.
Precisely. If the code is all scrambled up or hidden, it's much harder for those programs to recognize it as a threat.
Okay, that makes sense. So evading detection is a big one. Are there any other reasons why malware authors would go through all this trouble to obfuscate their code?
Another reason is to protect their intellectual property.
Their intellectual property. Wait, are you saying they're actually proud of their malicious code?
Well, think about it. They've invested time and effort into developing this malware. They don't want someone else just stealing their techniques or creating copycat versions. By obfuscating the code, they make it much harder for security researchers to reverse engineer their work and figure out how it all works.
Okay, so evading detection, protecting their code, those are two pretty compelling reasons. Are there any other benefits to obfuscation from the attacker's perspective?
Well, obfuscation can also buy them valuable time.
Time. How so?
The longer it takes for security researchers to analyze and understand the malware, the longer it can remain active in the wild, infecting systems, doing its dirty work. And that extra time can be crucial for an attacker, especially if they're targeting something really sensitive like financial data or critical infrastructure.
Like the malware gets a chance to do its damage before the defenses can catch up. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about one of the most challenging types of malware to analyze, rootkits. What makes them so difficult to deal with?
Rootkits are like the ninjas of the malware world. They operate at the deepest levels of the operating system, often gaining privileged access and hiding their presence from even the most sophisticated security tools.
So how do these rootkits manage to infiltrate the operating system so effectively?
Well, they often exploit vulnerabilities in the operating system itself or in legitimate device drivers. Essentially, they hijack the system's core functions to gain a foothold.
So they're like digital parasites, attaching themselves to the operating system and siphoning off its power.
That's a great analogy. And once they've gained access, they can manipulate system calls, hide files and processes, even alter the behavior of other programs. It's like they're rewriting the rules of the game to their advantage.
That sounds pretty dangerous. How do we even detect and analyze something that's designed to be invisible?
Detecting and analyzing rootkits requires a deep understanding of how the operating system works, its inner workings, and specialized forensic techniques.
Okay, specialized techniques. I'm all ears. What are some of the tools and strategies you use to expose these hidden threats?
Well, one approach is to analyze memory dumps, looking for signs of rootkit activity. We might also use kernel debugging tools to examine the operating system's core functions and look for any suspicious modifications. And it requires a very high level of expertise and specialized tools. Another technique is to use integrity checking tools. These tools compare the current state of the operating system to a known good baseline.
So it's like checking for tampering. Yeah. Looking for any changes that might indicate that a rootkit has been installed.
Precisely. And if we find any discrepancies, we can investigate further to determine the nature and extent of the compromise.
I can see why rootkit analysis is considered the expert level of malware investigation.
And the stakes are high. Rootkits can be very difficult to remove, and they can give attackers persistent access to compromised systems, allowing them to steal data, spy on users, and even launch further attacks.
Okay, I think we've established that rootkits are a force to be reckoned with. But let's move on to another challenging aspect of malware analysis. Anti-analysis techniques. You mentioned these earlier as well. Can you elaborate on what they are and why they make your lives so difficult?
Anti-analysis techniques are basically tricks that malware authors use to specifically hinder our analysis efforts. They're designed to slow us down, mislead us, and ultimately prevent us from understanding the malware's true purpose.
So it's like the malware is fighting back, actively trying to evade our scrutiny.
Exactly. They're designed to throw us off the scent, waste our time, make our lives difficult.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What are some of the sneaky things that malware does to thwart your analysis?
One common tactic is anti-debugging. The malware can actually detect if it's running inside a debugger, which is a tool we use to analyze code step by step, and then it'll change its behavior to try to hide what it's really doing.
It knows when it's being watched.
It's more like they set up tripwires. They use clever programming techniques to detect the presence of debugging tools, and then they modify their behavior to avoid scrutiny.
Sneaky. What else do they do?
Well, they can also use those packing and encryption techniques we talked about before to obfuscate their code. That makes it much harder and more time-consuming to analyze.
So they're adding layers of complexity to make the analysis process as difficult as possible.
Exactly.
How do you combat these sophisticated anti-analysis techniques?
It takes a combination of tools, specialized knowledge, and a lot of persistence. We use techniques like code unpacking to remove those outer layers of protection, debugger bypass techniques to avoid detection, and often custom scripts and plugins to automate parts of the analysis process.
I'm starting to get a real appreciation for the skill and expertise it takes to be a malware analyst. It's a constantly evolving field, requiring a deep understanding of both software development and cybersecurity.
Absolutely.
Okay, so far we've explored the treacherous landscape of obfuscation, ventured into the ninja-like world of rootkits, and encountered those deceptive anti-analysis techniques. But before we wrap up, I'm curious about one more thing. Ethics. You mentioned earlier that malware analysis is a powerful tool, and like any powerful tool, it can be used for good or for evil. What are some of the ethical considerations that malware analysts need to keep in mind?
That's a very important question. Malware analysis is a field that requires a strong ethical compass. We're dealing with sensitive information and the privacy of individuals.
So it's not just about technical skills, it's also about responsibility and integrity.
Exactly. First and foremost, we must always operate within the bounds of the law. We can't hack into systems without authorization or steal data that doesn't belong to us. We also have a responsibility to protect the privacy of individuals. If we're analyzing malware that's infected a system, we need to be very careful not to expose any personal information.
So respecting privacy and confidentiality is paramount. What other ethical principles are important?
Transparency and accountability are crucial as well. We should document our analysis process clearly and accurately so that others can reproduce our results and verify our conclusions. We should also be mindful of the potential impact of our work. The knowledge we gain from malware analysis can be used to develop defenses, but it can also be misused to create even more potent threats. We need to be aware of these dual-use implications and act responsibly. And it's about being part of a community that shares knowledge, collaborates, and works together to make the digital world a safer place for everyone.
Okay, I think we've covered a lot of ground. We've explored the motivations behind obfuscation, delved into the intricacies of packing and encryption techniques, faced the challenges of rootkit analysis, and even touched on the ethical considerations involved.
It's been a fascinating journey. And remember, this is just the tip of the iceberg. The world of malware analysis is vast and constantly evolving, so keep exploring, keep learning, and stay safe out there in the digital world.
Great advice. Well, that's it for this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us.
Until next time, happy analyzing.